Good evening, and welcome to the Master Gardener program on Working the Night Shift, Pollination After Dark. I'm Dina Henshin, Branch Manager at Middleburg Library, and your host tonight. Please feel free to send me your comments and questions during the program by using the chat feature, and I will relay them to Emily at the end of the program. Emily May is a pollinator conservation biologist and agricultural lead with the Xerces Society's pesticide program. She received a Master of Science in Entomology from Michigan State University and has studied pollinator habitat restoration, bee nesting habits, and the effects of pest management practices on wild bee communities. Her work with Xerces since 2015 has focused on supporting crop pollinators with habitat creation and protecting bees and other beneficial insects from pesticides. Welcome, Emily.
Thank you so much for having me. Can you hear me all right?
Yep,
Hey,
sound
great.
great.
Well, thanks so much for joining me this evening. I'm excited to talk with you all about pollination after dark. Over the last few years, we've learned a lot about how much other insects besides bees are contributing to pollination of our crops and wild plants, including those that are active at night, and how much they're also affected by all of the artificial lighting that we have around our houses and roads. So I hope that you're going to learn a few new things in this presentation and get motivated to go observe some moths and turn off the lights at night. So when we think about pollination, we probably picture a bee or a butterfly or maybe a hummingbird visiting flowers on a bright sunny day. And you'll also often see nursery plants advertised as butterfly or bee-friendly flowers, gardens that are designed specifically to attract these kinds of pollinators. Other daytime pollinators include flies and wasps and beetles. Many of these insects and birds are diurnal, meaning they're active during the day. And if you search for images of pollinators, same story here, you're probably going to see day active pollinators dominating the results, which makes a lot of sense because it's a lot easier to photograph pollinators visiting flowers during the daytime. But there are also a lot of truly beautiful insects out at night. And actually, insect activity is about, on average, a third higher at night than it is during the daytime. Over half of invertebrates are active at night. So this is the rosy maple moth, which is a relatively inconspicuous little green caterpillar that feeds on the leaves of different kinds of maple trees. As an adult, it is this incredible mix of colors. So you'll start seeing its activity in the late afternoon. So you may have seen it during the daytime at some point, but it mates and it lays eggs at night. So what else is out there at night? So as I said, insect activity is higher on average at night. And there's a growing body of research that's starting to shed light, for lack of a better way of saying it, on how important moths and other nighttime insect visitors, flower visitors, are for pollination, both in wild plants as well as in agricultural crops. There has been work done in Arkansas, which found that nocturnal insect visitors, and especially moths, contribute significantly to the pollination of apples. So in this study, they found that pollination over the night shift was almost equal to that of the pollinators that visited apple during the day in terms of how much they were contributing to the fruit set in that crop. There's also evidence showing that insect visitors at night are contributing to blueberries, bramble crops, other fruit crops, and visit a wide range of different kinds of crops. But these animals are really understudied, and that's partly because it's hard to do work at night and do the observational work that researchers do with bees during the day. They're sacrificing sleep to do that kind of field work, so it does require extra effort to get up and watch nighttime visitors. We're day active animals ourselves, so it's hard to break out of that pattern. What do we know at this point about nighttime pollinators and pollination? Nocturnal pollination has been observed in almost 2/3 of orders of flowering plants, and it's more common in plants that are adapted to live in dry conditions, which is something we'll talk a little bit about. We're starting to see how important moths and other nighttime visitors are for pollination in wild plant communities. So moths are extremely diverse, and they're known to pollinate many different kinds of plants and species, which makes plant pollinator networks, like this sort of general image of a pollinator network, quite a bit more complex than what they look like during the day. So this is a figure that shows an example of how nocturnal pollinators are contributing a lot of the interactions and the function to a network of plants and their pollinators. And this is just moths. There are also likely flies and beetles and other orders of insects that are active both at night and during the day, contributing to these networks that we haven't put in this figure. But we also know that artificial lighting is a threat to these nocturnal pollinators. And it's not something we think about as a threat to pollinators in general. But when we start thinking about all these insects that are active at night, more than half of the United States experiences light pollution at night, and the area that's affected by light is growing every year. Artificial lighting can really disrupt navigation, reproduction, and other functions of these insects, and reduce flower visits and fruit set by nocturnal pollinators. So we're going to talk more about this and solutions on how we can garden for nocturnal pollinators, as well as turn off the lights around our homes and communities towards the end of the talk. But first, let's dive into the pollinator night shift. So how or why does pollination happen at night? So there's lots of these pollinators visiting flowers during the day. Sunflowers actually close themselves up and tuck in for bed, think like a daylily when the darkness falls. But many flowers are still open at night with nectar available or pollen available for a late night snack. And some flowers actually open exclusively at night or have evolved to attract pollinators in the dark. So this is something that's called floral nyctinacea, flowers that open or close their petals at dusk in response to the onset of darkness. This is a showy evening primrose in my colleague Caitlin's yard at night, which opens up for business in the evening. Evening primrose got its name from that nyctinacea, or its opening of its petals at dusk. And I grew up in Maryland, so not far from you guys, but when I was a kid, lots of folks on my street would walk up and stand outside of my neighbor's yard watching. She had a yard full of evening primrose, and the spectacle of flowers popping open right at dusk was something fun to watch when I was a kid. But if you're a flower, you have all these daytime pollinators around. Why would you bloom at night? Did I skip one? No. So it may be, at least in part, a response to water stress. A review of all of the plant families and species found that nocturnal pollination tends to be associated with species that also have other water loss adaptations. So flowering at night happens more frequently in areas that are arid and dry. Flowering is this really water-intensive process. It takes a lot to produce a bloom, and light intensity is quite a bit less during the nighttime. It's almost a million. The light intensity between a sunny day and a full moon night, the light intensity differs by a factor of about 1 million. And between a full moon night and a new moon night, it's about a factor of about 500. So nighttime generally means higher humidity, lower temperatures, and lower wind speeds, all of which mean less loss of water if you're a plant producing a flower. So plants are losing less water through evapotranspiration. So they might also be able to produce flowers that are even showier or that provide more nectar or other resources to attract pollinators. So these flowers are an example of this. This is a species of cactus in the Sonoran Desert that put out these incredibly showy blooms just for one night in June or July. And then the rest of the year, they look pretty unremarkable. In some cases, other flowers may have evolved to benefit just specifically from nighttime pollinator visits. These relationships develop over many, many years, generations of plants and their pollinators. And so although many flowers are visited by both day and night pollinators, some flowers have features that are especially attractive to nighttime pollinators. So one thing to think about, light is limited when the sun goes down, and most animal eyes aren't very good at seeing colors in the dark. So unlike showy, colorful flowers appealing to daytime visitors, most flowers pollinated at night tend to be white or pale colored to better reflect that moonlight, what light is available, or to contrast well in the dark. Another common feature of flowers that tend to be pollinated at night is production of strong fragrance. So if you imagine following your nose is going to be easier than following your eyes in the dark, same is true for insects as well. There are adaptations that insects have to respond to and pick up those chemical stimuli, and so they're following their antennae into a flower that produces that fragrance. So many day-active flowers are day-pollinated flowers are fragrant, but some nocturnal flowers time the release of their fragrance just for that evening time when they're trying to get pollinators to come to them. There's also some theories that nocturnal flowers might be more likely to retain or produce heat that attracts pollinators in the lower temperatures of nighttime. Most insects don't produce their own heat. They need to stay above a certain temperature to stay active. So flowers that retain warmth are likely to be more attractive and help pollinators stay more active at night. So some flowers are retaining that heat from the sun, but some plant species actually produce their own heat. There's something called thermogenesis. This is an example here of a tropical plant that produces its own heat, and beetles like to crawl into these flowers to stay warm and active through the night. So this is a beetle pollinated plant. So coming back to the question of who are the pollinators, at night there's 4 main groups of nocturnal pollinators, and by far the largest and most diverse group of nocturnal pollinators are moths. They're found all over the world where there are flowering plants. The rest of these pollinators tend to be more concentrated at lower latitudes or closer to the equator. We have moths, beetles, and bees that are active in the evening into the night. And in the Southwest US, we also have bat pollinators at night. So it might surprise you to learn that there are actually quite a few bees that are active in that period of twilight and dusk or at night around the world, over 250 species of bees, according to a recent lit review on nocturnal pollination. And then there's beetles and flies that are also nighttime pollinators, as well as occasional pollination that's been documented by things as wide-ranging as crickets and ants and fireflies, thrips, geckos, and other mammals. So I sort of have started to talk about this a little bit, but pollinators don't get neatly divided into day and nighttime categorization. We're working with a 24-hour clock when it comes to insect activity. And a lot of these insects are falling into the twilight zone. So many pollinators are most active in this period around dusk or dawn. And the term to describe this is crepuscular, which is crepusculum is Latin for twilight zone. So crepuscular pollinators is another fun specific word for you. Not all moths are nocturnal, not all bees are diurnal or day active. There's always going to be exceptions. This is a hawk moth or a hummingbird moth here, which can be active in some of the crepuscular zones. Most bees are day active. So we have about 20,000 bee species. About 1% of those are what we would call crepuscular or nocturnal. But there are a few bees, groups of bees that are active at dusk until there's very little light in the sky. So this slide is showing you 2 species in the bee genus Lasioglossum, which is a genus of sweat bees. The bee on the left is a day active species, Lasioglossum incompletum, that's a generalist visitor of lots of different kinds of flowers. The bee on the right, Lasioglossum texanum, is a crepuscular species of sweat bee. And like many of the bees that come out at night, it's a specialist on flowers that open at that time, evening primrose family, that are starting to bloom at dusk. So what differences do you notice about these 2 bees? Did you notice the size difference between these structures on the tops of their heads? So if you thought bees have only 2 eyes, think again. These 3 round things on the top of bees' heads are actually simple eyes called ocelli that take in light and help bees to orient their position relative to the sun. So it makes a lot of sense that a crepuscular bee, a dusk-active bee, active in less light, is going to have evolved to have much larger eyes and much larger ocelli in order to take in more light when flying out for their dusk adventures. One of the other crepuscular bees you might be familiar with is the squash bee, which is commonly active at dawn and dusk, and they come out 1 to 2 hours earlier than other squash pollinators, like bumblebees, to take full advantage of that flower's resources. So we have a lot of bees that are falling into that crepuscular timeline, dawn and dusk, but there are a few species of bees that actually are truly nocturnal. So there's a few different groups of bees that have independently evolved adaptations, allowing them to fly and visit flowers on moonless nights. So this is one species at the top that's been seen flying on moonless nights, which is the large carpenter bee. The photo on top, which is native to Southeast Asia. And it typically doesn't fly in total darkness, but it is quite active on nights when the moon is out. And you can see those large ocelli on the top of its head. And then the one on the bottom there is the nocturnal sweat bee, Megaloptogenalis, which is a large-bodied sweat bee that lives in the rainforest understory. And its compound eyes are almost 30 times more sensitive to light than honeybees that are active during the day. And they have these incredible spatial and light processing power in their brains, whole neurons that are dedicated to processing the small number of light photons that are coming in and hitting their eyes. So that this bee's brain is doing a lot of work to process this tiny amount of light to be able to navigate through the tropical rainforest understory on a dark night. So that's bees that are active in dusk into the night. We also have beetle pollination happening at night, which is pretty understudied relative to bees and moths. Some beetle pollination definitely occurs during the day, but many beetle species are active at night visiting flowers for a little quick hit of nectar. This is an example of a fly and beetle pollinated flower, wild ginger, which is native in the Northeast US. And the flowers are very inconspicuous at the base of the plant. They smell like carrion, and they stay open day and night and attract flies and beetles in. But I'm actually going to spend a fair amount of this presentation diving into the world of moths because they are really the major players in nocturnal pollination. So I'm going to go through these questions and then talk about some interesting moth species. What do moths look like? What's their life history? What role are they playing in the ecosystem? Moths are extremely abundant and diverse. So I said we have about 20,000 species of bees. We have about 160,000 species of moths around the world, which is just incredible. If you compare that, we have about 17,000 species of butterflies worldwide. So there's almost 10 moth species for every one species of butterfly or bee. The US alone has 11,000 species of moths. So not all moths are pollinators, not all moths are active at night. So this is for all moths, not just the ones that are active at night. So first things first, how do you tell a butterfly apart from a moth? They both belong to the same insect order, Lepidoptera, so they are quite similar. And here I have what you might probably picture as a typical moth and a typical butterfly. Butterfly is flashy and colorful. This moth is camouflaged and discreet. And so these match the characteristics of a lot of butterflies and moths. So let's look at a trickier one. And now we have another drab insect, and then we have a flashy insect. So in this case, which one is the moth? And the easiest way to tell is the antennae. So the butterfly is actually on the left, and at the end of its antennae, it ends in a knob shape. So we call this a clubbed antennae. And then the moth is on the right. Its antennae ends in a point. Moths can also have feathery antennae, but they're not going to have a knob or a club at the end of it. Let's take another look at the first example. So in this case, the swallowtail has clubbed antennae, and the moth is hiding their antennae. So here's an example of feathery antennae. Male moths can have larger and more feathery antennae than females because they're covered in these pheromone receptors called sensilla that detect, locate, and track down females by the trail of pheromones that they're releasing. So in adults, we can look at antennae, but what about caterpillars? How do we tell those apart? So here's a couple caterpillars you might be familiar with. On the left are tent caterpillar moths, and on the right, a monarch butterfly in its larval stage. So the moths in this case are quite hairy, which is often seen in moth caterpillars and not in butterfly caterpillars. So if you've got a hairy caterpillar, it's a moth. But both of these are smooth and there's no hair to go on. So in this case, the moth is on the left and the butterfly is on the right. This is a member of sphinx moths that have hornworm caterpillars. So unfortunately, there's not always an obvious difference in some butterfly and moth caterpillars. But if a caterpillar is fuzzy or hairy, then it's likely to be a moth. There are no hairy butterfly larvae. That's the hornworm. So I'm going to bring up moth diversity again, just to show you this variety of different shapes of the types of moths. This is a silhouette guide from bugguide.net, which is a great resource if you're interested in identifying and learning about insects. It is helping you narrow down moth families by shape. So to give you an idea of the range of sizes, this is the largest moth in the world, the Hercules moth, which has a wingspan of 11 inches. And then, the smallest are in the genus Stigmella, which has a wingspan of about 3 millimeters. So there's wide diversity in shapes and sizes. Some moths are colorful. Most of those are active during the day, at some point during the day. Many moths are cryptic, which is another word for camouflaged. And so a couple of cryptic moths that deserve mention. On the left, these are the group of moths known as bird-dropping moths for their excellent, uncanny excellence of looking like bird poop. And then the peppered moth is on the right, and that spends the day resting against tree trunks and trying to go unnoticed by predators. So that moth actually has a really cool evolution story, as it evolved quite rapidly to get darker during the Industrial Revolution, when soot and smoke darkened the bark of trees in industrial areas of England where it's native. Like butterflies and some other kinds of insects, moths are a kind of insect that undergo complete metamorphosis, which means their development includes 4 life stages. The first being an egg that's laid on a host plant. That egg hatches into a larva or a caterpillar. Those caterpillars go through multiple stages or instars, and that's where the larva grows and sheds its skin. And then the larva spins a cocoon for its pupal stage. They can be in a pupa for a long time until environmental conditions cue them to come out. And then finally, the moth has reached its last life stage, where they are an adult, they go find a mate, lay more eggs, and then start all over. So the adult life stage can be quite short. Some species only live 2 days, don't have any mouth parts because their sole purpose in life is just to reproduce and get it over with. Other adults can live up to 3 months, and as adults and spend that time visiting and pollinating flowers. So we know what moths look like now. Let's talk about their behavior. One of the things that we are probably familiar with if you have a light outside is the moth's affinity for all things light. We have all seen moths attracted to lighting. So why are they so obsessed with light? The leading theory is that they are traveling by something called transverse orientation. And so they need to be able to see essentially the moon, that upper light source, to be able to navigate. They keep on course by keeping a fixed angle with the moon to stay in a straight line, same way that sailors would have navigated using the North Star. So the sudden appearance of artificial lighting after thousands of years traveling by transverse orientation has not given moths a lot of time to adapt. Why are you like this? It has inspired a lot of internet jokes because of how much they are attracted just to artificial lighting and backyard campground lighting and whatnot. When these moths are using a light source to navigate with that's much closer than the moon, transverse orientation doesn't work as a method of flying, so they end up running into the light. Some moths are migratory, so we think of the monarch butterfly during the day. That's a migratory species. Some moths also migrate. Some of them migrate north and south. Some migrate up and down in elevation on the sides of the mountains. The moon is a really important reference point for traveling moths. But some actually also use an internal geomagnetic compass. There's this species called the silver Y moth. This moth is found in Europe. It's a resident also in northern Africa. So they migrate from northern Africa up as far north as Finland. And so it's using wind current assisted migration. They hitch a ride on these fast, high air currents that mostly occur at night. And they're using a directional internal compass based on the geomagnetic. I'm losing a word there, but anyway, that's one of the other ways that they migrate and have direction, but not on a small scale, on a migratory scale. So moth behavior. Instead of a nose, moths generally are using their antennae to sense smells during the night. Their sense of smell is used to locate flowers to nectar on, host plants to lay their eggs on, which are releasing these volatile compounds they can pick up and sense. And they're also using them to find mates to reproduce with in the dark. Males tend to have larger, more feathery antennae, and not just because female moths swoon at the sight of large antennae. Like I said before, female moths are emitting these pheromones, which the male has to sense in order to find a mate. Most adult moths are generalists in terms of what they pollinate. They are visiting many of the same plants visited during the day by bees. A study in agricultural fields in England looked at hundreds of moths and sampled and analyzed the pollen from their underbellies and proboscis to figure out where they'd been. And so in this study area, the Nocturnal pollen transport network contained over 100 moth species and then dozens of plant species, including some that are visited frequently by daytime pollinators and some that were really only visited at night. So this is only a really small window into what's happening after dark, but there are 22 bee species for every one species that's looked at moths. So we have so much more to learn in this area. These moths are contributing to crop pollination as well as wild plant pollination. So they've been found on peas and brassicas and tree fruit and berries. There was a recent study that looked at red clover pollination and used time-lapse cameras, which is a neat way of not having to stay up late to look at these pollinators. So they used these time-lapse cameras to capture nocturnal flower visits and found that moths provide over a third of total flower visits to red clover and have been systematically overlooked in their contributions to these plants. There was another recent study that found that moths are also pretty efficient pollinators of bramble flowers, so blackberries and raspberries. The study authors experimentally bagged clusters of flowers and left them only open during the day or only open at night to compare how much visitation and fruit that they were getting. So more insects visited flowers during the day, but at night, pollinators actually deposited more pollen per visit. So if you think about it, it kind of makes sense that moths could be pretty good pollinators of some of the open flowers like apples and blackberries. Some of these moths are so fluffy, and they actually, some of the work that's been done in this area has found that moths are exhibiting a vibrating behavior when they visit flowers. Some of these moths, like the fall armyworm moth, it's almost like buzz pollination of flowers that some bees use to get more pollen out of flowers. So it's like a high frequency vibration. So yes, here we go. This is a photo of a fall armyworm moth that is vibrating her wings to stay warm and active while visiting an apple flower at night. And this is great for getting all this pollen up onto her fluffy body. So armyworm moths can be a pest of some crops and turf as caterpillars, but then pollinate other crops as adults. So expanding our perspective on what these insects are contributing. The other thing that's neat about moth pollination is it might be really important for plants for gene flow. So bees are a kind of insects that are fixed to wherever they build their nest, right? So you have small bees that are only traveling maybe 100 feet from their nest. There's some bees like honeybees and bumblebees that are traveling miles from their nest, but still fixed to a central nest site or hive. Moths are not tied to a nest, so they can travel really long distances. And so they're moving pollen quite far to distant plant populations. So migratory moths that might even fly a few hundred kilometers in a single night could be really important for this gene flow, pollen deposition between populations of plant species. And then there are also moths and plants that have really specialized relationships that are really tight knit together. So this is a yucca moth in a yucca flower. And these moths exclusively pollinate plants in the yucca genus. Yuccas don't make nectar, so other pollinators have very little reason to visit these flowers. This yucca moth only lives as an adult for 2 days. It doesn't have mouth parts because it's so short-lived. So it mates inside a yucca flower and then purposefully gathers pollen from the flower, flies to another yucca plant where she will lay a few eggs on the ovary of the flower, take the pollen that she carried with her and intentionally deposit it on the stigma of the flower. So most moths are incidental pollinators and get covered in pollen while they're looking for nectar, but this yucca moth is a very intentional pollinator. So the eggs laid in that flower will have yucca fruit to eat, and that yucca is then able to produce seeds. So it is a win-win for this plant and pollinator. This is another fun moth-plant relationship. This is the giant hawk moth, which is endemic to Madagascar. It was discovered in 1882, but its existence was predicted 20 years earlier and 6,000 miles away by Charles Darwin sitting in his London office looking at an orchid that had a very long nectar spur, with the nectar itself only at the very bottom of this nectar spur. And Darwin wrote in a letter to a friend, good heavens, what insect can suck this flower? And he predicted that scientists would one day discover a co-evolutionary partner for the orchid, an insect that had a proboscis that was a foot long. So 20 years later, they found this hawk moth, which then lent additional support to Darwin's whole theory of evolution between plants and pollinators. So here we are, we're just starting to better understand the contribution that has been overlooked for the most part by nighttime pollinators to pollination of crops and wild plants. And at the same time, we are learning that there are real negative impacts of light pollution and artificial light at night on nighttime pollinator activity and the ability of plants that are pollinated by those insects to reproduce. So there was a study from Switzerland that looked at the pollination of cabbage thistle, which is a species of thistle, with and without artificial street lamp lighting. The researchers placed these mobile lamps over plots of cabbage thistles that had never been exposed to artificial light and compared it to those that were in the dark. And they found that the plots that had artificial lighting had 62% fewer visits from insects than plots situated in darkness. And they also saw fewer pollinator species. So the ones that were lit up produced significantly fewer fruits than those that were in darkness. Even though daytime pollinators were usually more numerous than what was pollinating at night, they weren't able to make up the difference in lost pollination from nighttime pollinators under artificial lighting. So this is not only affecting moths, it's disrupting other nocturnal pollinators, and it's disrupting the plants that they pollinate. So let's shift into talking about solutions and gardening for the night shift. So in order to conserve nocturnal pollinators and what they are contributing to our wild plants communities, what they are contributing to our crops, there's some really key actions that we can take, and we need to kind of expand our perspective on the insects that we're providing habitat for. So the first step is providing habitat, food and shelter. So understanding what these insects need. Generally speaking, it's a lot of the same stuff that we're providing for daytime pollinators, but I'll talk about it in more detail. Reduce artificial lighting around our homes and communities. Avoid pesticides, especially in or near insect habitat, and then spread the word. Talk to our friends and neighbors and communities to spread the love and understanding of moths and other nighttime insects. So we can, as gardeners, take a variety of steps to create better habitat for nighttime insects. So you likely already have dozens, if not hundreds of kinds of night active insects in your yard if you're providing habitat for pollinators. General rules of thumb are the same. So increasing native plantings, the diversity of native plantings, and decrease hard surfaces. So the more diverse the number of native species you're providing in that yard, the more diverse the native insects will be that you're attracting, both in terms of also thinking about host plants for these moth species. The more native species you have, the more likely you're going to be hitting a variety of moth host plants. You can also do more by doing less. So less tidy yards are generally better for insects. One of the easiest ways to make your garden better for nighttime insects is just to stop working so hard. Moths and caterpillars need fallen leaves, old stems, other plant debris to help them hide from predators during the day and to provide good shelter and overwintering sites. So it can be helpful to delay cutting back old plants until the spring rather than doing it in the fall, and just generally to be less tidy. So one of the things that if you have a small space and you want your garden to look tidy in the summer, try leaving some of that old plant material behind the backs of borders or in other places that are more out of sight. Leaving the leaves and saving the stems to stand over the winter. You can then give yourself a pat on the back for gardening for wildlife. And we have lots of resources available on our website about this. Happy to take questions. Another thing for gardening for the night shift is turning off the lights. So these are steps to take that are more specific to nighttime pollinators beyond providing habitat. Artificial lighting is a significant threat to nighttime pollinators. It can disrupt their natural behaviors, their circadian rhythms, their ability to fly and navigate, find mates, and feed. So especially when it's, we're seeing the impacts and ultimately seeing declines in the populations of these flying insects. it's hard to know that much of the artificial light at night is actually not needed, especially when we as day active animals are asleep. So the first step that I usually recommend here is to just go out at night and observe your space. So trying to take that insect perspective, remembering that they are many times more sensitive to tiny differences in light than we are as day active animals. Just take a step back and see, what lights do you see? Do you see the splash of light coming from the inside of your house onto your garden? Do you or your neighbors have party lighting over the patio or vanity lighting on the exterior of the house? Is there an obvious street light or floodlight that you can see? And then, do you see sky glow from your city? So this is a starting point to just starting to understand light pollution in your local environment. Artificial light can also potentially increase moth predation at night, knowing that they are using a lot of different strategies to evade predators, and some of the predators might benefit actually from artificial light at night. Some might also not benefit. It's a little bit complex on the predation question. The best way to protect moths and other nocturnal insects from light pollution is to just turn off the lights. It's to reduce artificial lighting in both space and time. So there's research that's been done on fireflies, suggesting that light intensity and not the temperature of the color, at least for those insects, is the main driver of disrupted mate finding. So simply changing light spectrum might not work for some insects. So it can be good for just reducing disruption to some insects, using, changing from cold to warm, installing red LEDs or red filters over existing lights. That's better for us too and our circadian rhythms as mammals, but it's not the full solution for every insect. So generally speaking, we need to be finding ways to reduce light in space and time. There's usually steps that we can take for our own house or apartment for light pollution. It can be putting up curtains that you keep closed at night, or putting motion detectors or timers on your outdoor lighting. So the thing to ask yourself is, does this lighting have a clear purpose, and is it needed? Is it targeted? So in my experience, there are a lot of lights that you can keep off most of the time and use a motion detector for when you do need light. So if that's for moving inside from your driveway, or for the feeling of safety that comes from lights turning on when there's motion outside, motion detectors are a great tool to be able to really think about clear purpose and need for lighting, and whether you can put that light on that motion detector. If you can't have them on a motion detector, if you can't just have them off, dimming, hooding, and shielding is a great option if turning them off is not an option. And I would recommend checking out Dark Sky International, which has a lot of resources available on reducing light pollution. At the community and state level, there's also important work to be done to reduce lighting impacts. So most migratory birds fly at night. Orioles, thrushes, sparrows, warblers, vireos. Overly lit structures can tempt migrating birds into bird strikes on buildings. There are up to 1 billion birds that are killed by building collisions every year. And while big, large skyscrapers and other buildings kill the most on a per building basis, individual residences actually cumulatively kill the most birds. So this overuse of lighting at night is important for insects, but it's also important for migratory birds. And it's something that could be worked on in community and at the state level. This is from Lights Out Connecticut, which is a group from Connecticut Audubon that helped pass legislation last year to turn off non-essential outdoor lighting for state-owned buildings between the hours of 11 and 6 a.m. to protect migratory birds during their migration. And there's other Lights Out programs around the country at the state level and at the city level. So you could look into that for figuring out what might work for state and municipal standards to help reduce unnecessary lighting. One thing we can also think about as gardeners, when we're trying to garden for wildlife in places that have a lot of outdoor lighting already, including a lot that we can't do anything about, like streetlights, you can also work to create dark zones. So if you think about light like a pollutant, how could you best protect your garden? So you could try and plant trees and shrubs to block or absorb the artificial lighting from the streetlight or from your neighbors that have a floodlight, just like you might plant dense vegetation as a barrier to pesticide drift if you were trying to protect your pollinator garden from your neighbor's pesticide applications. So creating darker spaces within the garden could help create some of those zones that are dark enough for nocturnal insects to be able to hunt around and to find mates. So I mentioned pesticide drift. Another important step in managing spaces for any pollinator is limiting pesticide contamination. So just like for daytime pollinators, we're planting attractive plants for pollinators. We want to avoid pesticides in our yards and gardens. So many pesticides that are available for home and garden use are harmful to moths, fireflies, and other nocturnal insects, as well as the ones that are active at day. This includes the backyard barrier treatments, the conventional ones applied for mosquito and tick control, as well as granular treatments for grub control in lawns. So what we don't want to do is create ecological traps where we have done all of this important work to attract in and support these beneficial insects and then accidentally harm them by applying pesticides in those areas. So part of managing gardens in general for moths, butterflies, bees, other wildlife is shifting our expectations about what it looks like. So if you're gardening for wildlife and you're planting native plants, signs of plant damage from insects probably means you're doing it right. You're doing a good job. Insects are using your garden. So one of the things that helps me with this and also helps me take a pause whenever I think, oh, I need to intervene here, is learning to go recognize common insects and also take out your phone and use a smartphone app, try and help identify things that you don't recognize. Suddenly you'll start to see how many different kinds of insects your garden is actually supporting. You might find a cool caterpillar of a moth on a plant, or a cool caterpillar of a butterfly, or some other insect, a milkweed leaf beetle, something you've never seen before. And that can really help in this whole process of rewilding and learning to garden for wildlife. So before I end, I also wanted to specifically just mention bug zappers, which I honestly can't believe are still sold in stores. So there's been research done on these, and research done in Florida. Out of 10,000 insects killed by one bug zapper in one night, only 8 were mosquitoes. So these are still widely available despite overwhelming evidence that they are useless for controlling pest insects like mosquitoes. There are an estimated 4 million bug zappers in use across the United States. If those are operating for an average of 40 nights a year, they killed an estimated 71 billion harmless or beneficial insects like moths. So bug zappers are something that might be okay for indoor use, but I would not recommend them for use outdoors. So not to end on that note, it's clear that nocturnal pollinators play really important roles in plant communities and natural ecosystems, and we have a lot more to learn about the details of the relationships that they have with different kinds of plants, what kind of species they're interacting with, how they're promoting that kind of gene flow across ecosystems, what they really need in terms of habitat and how we can best support them. But I hope I've whetted your interest in learning more. One of the things that's nice about giving this talk in July is it's a great time to go outside at night and try and observe insects that are active at that time. The last week of July is National Moth Week, so that would be a great time to go out and observe some moths. If you go to National Moth Week, I don't remember what the website is, but if you Google it, they have events across the country, public and private events happening, celebrating moths, learning to observe moths, doing moth blitzes on iNaturalist, where people are setting up sheets and directing a light onto them, figuring out what moths are coming to their sheet, and documenting it on those smartphone apps. So something to look into if you have gotten excited about learning more about what's in your garden at night. So with that, I will just thank our supporters. This slide got a little messed up. And I will take questions. Thanks so much for sticking with us and joining us tonight.
Thank you, Emily. That was a fascinating discussion. I had a question. How did you get interested in this line of work? I'm always curious.
Yeah, so I got interested in insects actually through bees. So I got interested in bees through food and agriculture. I went to college in Vermont and got involved with the farm there. And so I got interested in bees through their contribution to pollinators, to pollination of crops. And then I got interested in insects more broadly from there. So it wasn't necessarily like the early bug nerd. I became a bug nerd later in life, and have enjoyed every minute since.
Nice. So I apologize for this one. And you might be able to answer it better than I. Normally, who is a regular attendee to these programs and a master gardener, she wrote, "They do look fluffy. What is the fluff made of?" But I didn't catch which slide she was talking about, so maybe you know which one she was talking about.
Yeah, so I'm assuming you're talking about the moths being fluffy, and just like butterflies, moths have scales on their wings. And that's what, so Lepidoptera, I forget what the name actually means, but it's something like scale wing, I think, in Latin. And so a lot of that fluff is the scales. So just like a butterfly.
Great. I have a question of who are or what are the moth predators at night?
Yeah, so there's lots of different predatory arthropods as well as mammals out at night. So a big one would be bats. Bats are active at night out catching insects. But there's also predatory arthropods, so things like spiders are active at night. And, there are other reptiles and mammals that might be out as well. But yeah, that's some of, Luna moths, if you can picture the beautiful, amazing green Luna moth with its long tails, the leading theory on why it has tails that look like that is that when they flutter around as the Luna moth is flying through the night, they distract bats and they disrupt bat echolocation so that the Luna moths are able to escape, and the bat is confused about, what's flying around and where it is.
Very good. Thank you. What is your best advice for attracting, I'm sorry, I'm having trouble, for attracting nighttime pollinators, the simplest advice?
Yeah, the simplest advice is just to plant native and plant diversity. So if you, and thinking about diversity at the family level, so if you have, a lot of things in the aster family, you're going to attract a ton of different kinds of bees that love asters. That's the aster family is stuff like sunflowers and goldenrods and even dandelions are in the aster family. But when you're trying to broaden out and capture a diversity of moths and butterflies and other things that need host plants, diversifying out to other plant families. So that would be, the mint family, the asparagus family, as well as the aster family. Just thinking about your garden, how can you provide as much diversity and as much flowering, as much flowering through the season as possible? That's going to capture both the things that need to eat the plants as well as those things that then visit the flowers for nectar or pollen.
Thank you.
Hopefully that was simple enough. It's just
Yeah. Is nighttime pollination as important as daytime pollination? Is there like a comparison? Are they both equally?
So they're both important. It's going to depend on the plant, but it is, I think I talked about how there have been these studies looking at, like, say, bramble flowers, where there were fewer nighttime visitors, but they were actually providing more pollen per visit. So in some plant species and in some plant families, they're going to be providing even more of that pollination. So there may be situations where nighttime pollinators are providing half of the visits, might be more, depends on the plant species. But yes, they could be quite important contributors to pollination of plants.
Okay, I have another one. I see a dramatic reduction in all insect numbers in my garden, including moths, especially in the last several years. Is this a documented phenomenon countrywide?
Yes. There is, the anecdotal evidence for sure that there are declines in insects active both in the day and at night. If you think about the types of insects you might have seen and the abundance of insects you might have seen on your windshield 50 years ago as opposed to now. Even when I was a kid, I think there were more bugs on my windshield than there are now. And it's not just because those cars are more aerodynamic. There's documented declines in lots of different kinds of insects. We don't always have, the long-term monitoring data and the specific monitoring data to say this species is in decline and that species is in decline, but Lepidoptera, butterflies and moths, are among the most threatened, generally speaking. They make up a lot of the species that end up getting petitioned for protection under the Endangered Species Act. So I think there's a lot of things going on. There's climate disruption that's happening. A lot of these insects are quite affected by climate conditions on a daily, monthly, annual basis. So some years they are definitely going to be more abundant just based on environmental conditions. And then there's other things happening. They're losing habitat on a broad scale through, conversion of cropland to more intensive cropland, conversion to development, loss of habitat within that developed land to turf grass or pavement. And then there's pesticide use. So I think one of the things that is very difficult to understand and document is what's happening in residential yards. So that is not an area where pesticide use is generally tracked, and there is a lot of pesticide use that happens in residential yards. So thinking about like the every other week mosquito Joe treatment, that's going to have pretty significant impacts on insects that are living in those yards and gardens. So that's something that has increased even since the pandemic, just based on sales data. Residential pesticide use has increased since 2020 as people have turned to be more in those garden spaces. Unfortunately, that also means that lots of other insects have declined. So I'm grateful that you're here tonight and working towards better solutions, because we need every yard that we can to be a space for wildlife to reside.
Do you have any natural recommendations for people that struggle with mosquito bites or bug bites that would be healthier for the environment and for the pollinators?
Yeah, especially, last year, so I live in an area that has very high mosquito pressure, I would say. And last year it was basically unlivable outside. And so one of the solutions there that I have started using is something that was recommended by Doug Tallamy, if you know Doug Tallamy of Bringing Nature Home, which is setting up a 5-gallon bucket. This is specifically for mosquitoes. So if you're worried about mosquitoes, set up a 5-gallon bucket, fill it about halfway full with water, and then fill that water with like cut grass or straw. And what that does is create the perfect situation for a gravid female mosquito looking to lay eggs into this soupy, stagnant water that smells really good to it. In that 5-gallon bucket, you can put what's called a mosquito dunk, which is a biopesticide that affects only the larvae of developing flies. So that would be mosquitoes and other flies. So you've attracted in mosquitoes. You have basically not allowed their larvae to develop. You have this trap that does not affect other insects besides maybe some other flies that might be laying eggs in there. So it's much different than, let's say, a barrier treatment of a pyrethroid, which is what most of those conventional mosquito treatments are. That's applied to basically all of the standing vegetation in a backyard. And for me, I just started using it this year. I have about 2 acres, and I've put out 3 traps in the areas where mosquitoes tend to breed, where I can't actually reduce standing water and do the other things that need to be done to do it, in a more cultural, natural way. And so it's been really effective. Yeah. So I will speak to that this year. The other things to do are the basics of reduce standing water, making sure you're emptying out your kids' toys and containers that have picked up water over the years or over the weeks when you get rainfall. A mosquito, when it lays eggs, and I apologize for rambling here, I thought a lot about mosquitoes since last year. A mosquito lays its eggs and they take about a week to develop. So you want to be emptying out standing water more frequently than a week. So ideally on, every 4 or 5 days, you want to be emptying out that water. They can breed in as little as a bottle cap of water. So they can produce larvae in those small little bits of water that are standing around the garden. So make sure you're emptying out your containers. That's really important for mosquito management. And then a strong fan on the patio can also do wonders.
Ah, the bucket procedure, is that called something? If people want to look it up, what's it called?
I would Google Doug Tallamy mosquito dunk trap. There was
How
a
do you
blog,
spell Calamity?
yeah, there was a blog from an Audubon chapter that had a detailed description of how to do it with photos. Um,
Mosquito.
I ended up getting one from a hydroponic supplier that had a top that came with it that had kind of a mesh, a plastic mesh over the top. So things like birds wouldn't be able to get in. The mosquitoes just kind of fly in through the holes.
Okay, very good. Well, I don't think I have any more questions. I got several thank yous, and several people said that they learned a lot. And I want to thank you for doing the presentation and thank everybody for attending. I have recorded this program, and it will be on the Loudoun County Public Library YouTube channel, probably in about a week or so, so that if anybody wants to view it or if anybody missed it, they can check it out there. And thank you, everybody, and have a good night.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.